To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
In 1975, a 3-year-old boy disappeared in Richmond, Virginia. 4 days later, his body was found in the James River. With no leads, police turned their focus to a 20-year-old neighbor, Marvin Grimm Jr. After a marathon interrogation and 2 polygraphs, Marvin confessed. He later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life. But decades later, DNA testing and expert analysis exposed deep problems with the confession and the forensic claims used to secure the conviction. And in 2024, Marvin was officially exonerated. This is Forensic Tales, episode 315, The Story of Marvin Grimm Jr. It was a Saturday, November 22nd, 1975, in Richmond, Virginia. That was the start of a parent's worst nightmare. Your child goes missing and you have no idea what happened, what went wrong, who took them. On that particular day, a 3-year-old boy, who will identify only as CH, was seen entering the woods behind his parents' apartment. It's unclear why the boy was by himself or what the exact circumstances were before this happened. And to be honest, we still don't have the answers to those questions even 5 decades later. All that's been reported is that he was last seen around 1:30 p.m. entering the woods. About an hour later, his mom reported him missing to the police. And within hours, there was a massive search party to find this missing little boy. He's only 3 years old. His communication skills are probably very limited. He's alone. He's probably scared. The desperation to find this boy was very, very high. Over the next 4 days, over 350 people were out there in the woods. They were volunteers, police officers, neighbors, complete strangers. Helicopters were brought in to search from the sky. This quickly became one of the most extensive search operations in Richmond history. For 96 hours, the boy's family prayed he would return home safe. And for 96 long hours, the police and volunteers did everything they could to make that possible. But that's not how things turned out. On November 26th, the boy's body was found lying face up and fully clothed in the shallow water of the James River. This was a spot approximately 9 miles away from his parents' apartment. His arms were folded across his chest as if he were asleep. This was just a poor 3-year-old little boy. When the boy's autopsy was done, the medical examiner, Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro, determined that he had died of asphyxia with no indication that he drowned or suffered any other physical injury. So just by looking at the body, there weren't any obvious signs of foul play. But she also said this. She found that there was a moderate amount of mucus in the boy's throat and that a microscopic analysis of smears revealed the presence of sperm. I know that's something no one wants to think about when talking about a young child victim. But this is a detail about the autopsy you'll want to remember for much later. And the awful details about the poor little boy's death don't end there. The boy's toxicology report indicated the presence of 3 things: alcohol, Tylenol, and clozoxazone, a muscle relaxant. There was a 0.12% level of alcohol found in his blood, 1.5 milligrams of the muscle relaxant in his liver fluid, and 5.5 milligrams of Tylenol in his stomach. These were all substances found in his system at the time of his death. Another detail you'll want to keep in the back of your mind. So pausing there for a second, With a case that has these types of details: 3-year-old victim, murder, asphyxia, alcohol and muscle relaxers in his system, these are all things that made this case so high profile. Not just high profile around Richmond, but this was a case that gained national media attention. And with that media attention came the desire and urgency to find the person responsible. People wanted someone arrested, and they wanted someone arrested quickly. So not surprisingly, the Richmond Police Department found themselves under a lot of pressure to deliver on a suspect. And luckily for them, they had one. Within days, the Richmond Police Department named a suspect in CH's murder: 20-year-old Marvin Grimm Jr. Marvin Grimm was a Navy veteran who lived with his wife in the apartment across the way from the victim and his family. From what I could find, this was the first time Marvin ever found himself in trouble. He didn't have a criminal record. He was just a neighbor who lived in an apartment nearby with his new wife. He was first connected to this case on the very same day that CH went missing, right after the mom called the police to report him missing. Officers went door to door throughout the apartment complex, speaking with neighbors. They wanted to find out if any of them knew or saw anything. And one of those neighbors was Marvin Grimm and his wife. So the police spoke with him within hours of the boy's initial disappearance. He also found himself on the police's radar after the victim's father told detectives that he and Marvin weren't exactly friendly neighbors. In fact, according to the father, they had gotten into at least 2 separate arguments in the days before CH's disappearance. The first was over Marvin apparently running his lawnmower over some of the children's toys in the front yard of the apartment. And the second was in response to CH playing outside in his underwear. So as you can see, neither one of these arguments was over anything serious. But to the police, it showed that there was some tension between the boy's family and Marvin Grimm Jr. Could that be a potential motive? So now, when they're looking for suspects, Marvin seems to check off some of the boxes. He's physically close to the victim. They all live in the same apartment building. And he knows the family. He doesn't seem to get along with the victim's father. And it wasn't just the dad who seemed to have bad things to say about him. It was also the boy's mom. On November 25th, the day before the boy's body was found, CH's mom told police that, quote, she felt Marvin was odd in his actions, end quote. She said this before providing the same details as to the arguments between Marvin and CH's father. So on December 5th, the Richmond Police Department officially named Marvin Grimm as a possible suspect. They specifically cited the 2 arguments and his, quote, odd behavior. But keep in mind, at this point, the police had 0 physical or forensic evidence linking him to the crime. 0. He was named a suspect based on what the family said and his physical proximity to the boy. Like I said earlier, the police were under a lot of pressure to make an arrest, so they might have had tunnel vision when looking to arrest someone. And Marvin Grimm was an easy target. After working a 9-hour shift at work, he was picked up by the police and brought down to the station for questioning. The interview started at around 5 p.m., and by 9 o'clock, the police felt like they were starting to get somewhere. It was around that time that Marvin started making some pretty incriminating statements, or at least statements that the police found incriminating. Up until 9 o'clock, they never advised him of his Miranda warnings. Also, up until 9 o'clock, 4 hours into the questioning, Marvin denied having anything to do with what happened to CH. But several hours in, he made a statement about blacking out and having seen CH around 3 o'clock the day he disappeared. So based on what he said, he was an official suspect. And with that label, he was finally read his Miranda rights, and the police began questioning him about his background and family life. By 11 o'clock, the interview was over 6 hours long. Also, don't forget, the police brought him in after a 9-hour work shift. So, as you can imagine, Marvin was probably feeling pretty tired and fatigued at this point. He just wanted to go home and call it a night. But the police weren't going to let that happen. Throughout the night, they would administer 2 polygraph tests, to which he passed both of them, and eventually elicit a full confession. A full confession made without the presence of an attorney and after hours upon hours of interrogation. A confession didn't match any of the facts. As soon as the confession was out on the table, Marvin told police what happened, and I say what happened with quotation marks around it. Most of what he said didn't actually line up with the facts of the case, and what did match was already made public in the media. So he didn't tell the police anything they didn't already know. That very night, he went with police officers as they retraced all the steps, from CH's abduction to his murder, and eventually where he supposedly disposed of his body. Once they did that, Marvin and the cops returned to the interview room at around 2:30 in the morning. This was approximately 9 hours after the interview began and 18 hours since he started his workday. This was also the moment that police first began recording the interview. For 9 hours, none of this police interrogation was recorded. Once the tapes finally started rolling, Marvin said that on the morning of CH's disappearance, he woke up to what appeared to be CH and another kid throwing things at cars outside. He said after that, he decided to go to his mom's home and get some food for the weekend. When he got back home, he said that CH and the other kid asked him if any of the food in the bag was for them. But Marvin said no and went inside his apartment. He said it was about 12:45 p.m. But here's where his story gets fuzzy. He said that after he got inside, he turned on a football game before blacking out sometime during the second period. Yes, that was really what he told detectives. He blacked out. He then said he left the house and went to the laundry building in the apartment complex. There he saw CH again. He asked Marvin if he would take him to the convenience store for a soda. But instead of stopping by the 7-Eleven like CH asked him, Marvin took him behind a nearby motel and, quote, forced sexual assault on him. Those were in his words during the recorded interview. Marvin said that after he killed him, he wrapped his body up inside his peacoat and drove him to the river where he tossed the boy into the water. But as he tossed him in the water, he tore one of his shoes. He then drove home and later took part in the search for CH. Now, here's an interesting detail that was missing from the confession. During his recorded confession at 2:30 in the morning, Marvin made no mention of the alcohol or drugs found in the boy's system. He didn't explain how they got there. He didn't say whether or not he gave it to him. He didn't mention a thing about it, which should have raised some red flags. If he supposedly confessed to almost every detail about this awful crime, why would he leave that part out? The confession also didn't provide any new geographic information to the police. The local media had already extensively reported on where the boy was found, so none of Marvin's supposed confessions really offered any new information. Almost everything he said had already been reported on in the media. This was something else that should have been a massive red flag. Later that day, on December 17th, Marvin was arrested on charges of first-degree murder, sodomy, and abduction with intent to defile. For the community, it was a huge relief. This was one of the worst crimes this area had ever seen. So to have someone behind bars and someone who confessed, the people of Richmond felt good about that. So did the police. Despite obvious issues with how Grimm was interrogated and questioned, they did their jobs. They had a suspect behind bars. So right after the arrest, the police went in and executed a search warrant of his apartment and car. They had a confession, but they still didn't have any physical or forensic evidence. So they hoped that they would be able to find something there. Inside the apartment, they collected a few items, including his shoes and his peacoat. Then from his car, they collected 2 towels and 2 strands of hair. This was important because, according to his confession, he transferred the boy and assaulted him inside the car. So there should have been some sort of forensic proof proving he was there. All of the items were then sent to the Virginia Division of Forensic Science, DFS, where it was analyzed by forensic analyst Mary Jane Burton. That might be a name you've heard of before. Without turning this into an entire episode about some of the controversy surrounding Mary Jane Burton, she's been linked to several wrongful conviction cases. In fact, as recently as 2024, the Virginia State Crime Commission has been reviewing criminal cases involving her work to determine the number of people impacted by her work. And interestingly enough, a lot of the scrutiny about her work came after the release of the podcast, Admissible: Shreds of Evidence, which called into question the quality and accuracy of her work. Unfortunately, Mary Jane Burton passed away in 1999, but according to the State Crime Commission, they are currently reviewing more than 2,700 criminal cases she's connected to. Between December 1975 and March 1976, the evidence sat at the lab and Marvin Grimm sat in jail. But before there could be a trial, something unexpected happened. There was a plea. On March 10, 1976, Marvin went before Richmond Judge Frank Wright and pleaded guilty to everything. He pled guilty to all the charges against him. But before Judge Wright would accept the plea and impose a sentence, he scheduled an evidentiary hearing for 5 days later on March 15th. This was the first time we heard about any of the forensic evidence in the case. At the hearing, one of the detectives who interrogated Grimm testified to how he confessed, how he walked them through everything he did to CH, and how he basically admitted to everything. But that wasn't anything new. What everyone wanted to hear was what the crime lab found on the evidence that was collected. The prosecution presented Mary Jane Burton's report on the 2 strands of hair that were found inside his car. She also reported on a child's sock that was also reportedly found. According to her analysis, the hairs were consistent with CH's and not consistent with Marvin. She also said that the hairs found on the peacoat were consistent with the boy's hair and not consistent with the defendant. So according to her, all of the hair evidence suggested that Marvin's confession was accurate. He had been inside his car, just like Marvin said, and his body had been wrapped in the coat during the disposal process. Again, just like he confessed to. So far, all of this lines up with the confession. It seems pretty much like a slam dunk evidentiary hearing for prosecutors, but that's only the hair evidence. Let's get to the DNA. With so many options for weight loss treatment plans, it can be hard to know what's the best choice, who to trust, what to know about side effects, and if something's even going to work. That's why hers offers access to doctor-developed treatment plans that are personalized to you. Hers goes beyond medication by offering access to ongoing care, dosage and medication adjustments, lifestyle and nutrition tips, and 24/7 support with no hidden costs or membership fees. And with options starting at just $69 per month with a 10-month plan when paid up front in full, hers provides access to options that fit your goals and your budget. Feel like your best self again? Visit forhers.com/tales to get a personalized, affordable plan that gets you. That's forhers.com/tales, forhers.com/tales. Weight loss by Hers is not available everywhere. Compounded drug products are not approved or evaluated for safety, effectiveness, or quality by the FDA. Prescription required. See website for full details, important safety information, and restrictions. Actual price depends on product and plan purchased. Mary Jane Burton also wrote in her report that she tested the swabs of the boy's throat that were taken during the autopsy. She also performed tests on the towel recovered from Marvin's car. And according to her serology report, which was dated March 12, 1975, 2 days after Marvin entered his guilty plea and 3 days before the hearing, Her results showed that the testing on the throat swabs excluded Marvin. This was a very important part of the case because semen was found in this poor little boy's throat based on the medical examiner's report. And according to Marvin, he sexually assaulted CH. But now, according to the serology testing, he can be excluded as the source of the semen. She also found type O blood on the samples. Marvin Grimm Jr., he had type A. So the only physical evidence that seemed to support the alleged confession was the hairs, but the DNA didn't match. To some, that might not be enough. Hair analysis isn't always accurate. It's definitely not as good as DNA or blood evidence. Well, for this judge, Judge Wright, based on all that was presented during the evidentiary hearing, the judge decided to accept Marvin's guilty plea. And in May of 1976, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As most of us who follow true crime know, once you're in the system, it's very hard to get out. Yes, there's an appeal process here in the US, but the chances of actually being granted an appeal or even a new trial are extremely, extremely low. And DNA testing after you've been convicted. Sometimes that can be even harder to get. And this case was even trickier because Marvin Grimm confessed. Even without all of the forensic evidence lining up with his story, he still confessed to doing this. So once he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, it was pretty much lock him up and throw away the key. It's now March of 1989. Marvin's been in prison for 13 years. It was during 1989 that Marvin filed his first petition for DNA testing. But to no one's surprise, that petition was denied by the courts. Again, once you're in the system, it's very hard to find a way out or anyone who will listen. 2 years later, this time in 1991, Marvin requested DNA testing again. This time, he was represented by a different attorney who filed the petition on his behalf. But just like 2 years prior, the request was denied. Fast forward several more years, 2003. In December 2003, he tried something different. He filed a petition for a writ of actual innocence. He was essentially asking the court to overturn his conviction. In his petition, he argued that all of the DNA evidence in the case actually excluded him as CH's killer. Most importantly, all of the testing that had been done years earlier excluded him as the source of the biological evidence found in his throat. The semen evidence. So that alone should help prove actual innocence. But the court saw it a different way. In May of 2004, the Supreme Court of Virginia, which is the highest court in the state, denied the petition. They essentially said that the petition was filed way too late, and that not only had Marvin confessed, but police had confirmed, quote, much of the detailed descriptions in the confession. So, once again, even though none of the biological evidence matched, a confession is a confession. Why would Marvin say he did this horrible, horrible crime if he was actually innocent? If you've never falsely confessed to a crime, which most of us haven't, it's very hard to understand why anyone would. Fast forward in time again, February 2012. By this point, Marvin and his attorneys had been fighting for decades. And once again, they went back to court, filing another writ of actual innocence, grounded in DNA testing. This petition focused on two major points. First, DNA testing on hairs connected to the case excluded the victim. At the evidentiary hearing back in the 70s, it was Mary Jane Burton who said the hairs were consistent with the victim. There was no DNA testing done back then. And number two, swabs taken from CH's mouth, throat, and nose excluded Marvin as a contributor. But once again, the prosecution pushed back. They opposed the petition, and ultimately, the court dismissed it. The Virginia Supreme Court pointed to the same issues it had before: Marvin's guilty plea and his confession. The court also emphasized that some of the forensic results were labeled inconclusive. 2 hairs didn't produce usable DNA profiles, and some of the swabs failed to yield enough DNA to test at all. Because of that, and because Marvin had admitted guilt decades earlier, the court ruled that the DNA evidence wasn't strong enough on its own to overturn the conviction. So it was back to prison. By 2017, he had been incarcerated for more than 4 decades. Think about that. 4 decades. He didn't have many legal options left. All his court petitions failed. DNA evidence, while troubling, still wasn't enough to overturn a confession made in the 1970s. So in August of that year, he tried something different. He petitioned the current governor of Virginia, asking for a pardon. After more than 45 years behind bars, he was finally free to breathe outside prison walls. But that freedom didn't come easy or without heavy conditions. The first thing he was required to do after getting out of prison was register as a sex offender. So even as he stepped back into the world, the system still treated him as guilty, branding him, tracking him, and restricting him. In October of 2021, something finally shifted. That year, the Virginia General Assembly authorities did something that had never been done before. They allowed post-conviction DNA testing at private labs, not just state-run ones. For people like Marvin Grimm Jr., that changed everything. It opened a door that had been closed for decades. So immediately after this announcement, his legal team filed a motion asking that the evidence be retested, this time by mitotyping technologies. The court granted the request, and what the testing revealed fundamentally rewrote the ending to the story. Back in 2012, the state's forensic lab had tested several hairs connected to the investigation. Most excluded the victim, but 2 hairs were labeled inconclusive. But with mitotyping's testing, they removed all the uncertainty. This lab was able to exclude the victim as the source of, number 1, the 2 previously inconclusive hairs. Number 2, multiple hairs found inside the car. Number 3, a hair recovered from the sock. And number 4, several hairs taken from Marvin's peacoat. In total, 7 hairs were analyzed, and they came from 7 different people. Not one of them belonged to Marvin Grimm Jr. At the same time, experts took another look at the biological evidence tied to the most serious allegations in the case: the alleged sperm found inside the victim's mouth and throat. Well, as it turns out, there was no sperm found in the boy's mouth or throat. And the towel that had been collected from Marvin's car, once believed to contain semen, also tested negative for seminal fluid. It was like the entire forensic foundation of the case had now collapsed. In April of 2023, Marvin's legal team, including attorneys from the Innocence Project and the law firm Arnold and Porter K. Scholar, filed a new petition for a writ of actual innocence. This time, the science was accompanied by expert analysis. A nationally recognized false confession expert, Richard Leo, reviewed the case and concluded that Marvin's confession showed multiple hallmarks of being unreliable. For instance, key details in the confession didn't match the actual evidence. And when Marvin couldn't provide answers, it seemed like the police just fed him the details, filling in the gaps for him. Another expert looked at the child's toxicology report. Remember, from the top of the episode, there were at least 3 substances, including alcohol, found in the boy's system. Well, this expert's conclusions completely changed everything. Based on the substances found in the child's system, the ingestion had occurred at least 90 to 150 minutes before death. But police records showed Marvin was back in his apartment within 75 minutes of the child last being seen. In other words, the timeline made Marvin's involvement impossible. Then came the moment no one could have imagined decades earlier. In its response to the petition, the Virginia Attorney General's office agreed that Marvin Grimm Jr.'s convictions should be vacated, and they didn't stop there. Prosecutors acknowledged that the evidence had been so thoroughly debunked that there was no longer proof the child had been the victim of a crime at all. They also conceded that the scientific evidence largely undermined Marvin's confession, and stated plainly that if modern DNA testing had existed in 1975, Marvin would have been excluded immediately, and never would have had the chance to falsely confess. On June 18, 2024, the Virginia Court of Appeals granted the writ. After nearly half a century, the court ruled what Marvin Grimm Jr. had been saying all along: he was innocent. Marvin Grimm Jr. spent nearly 50 years labeled as something he wasn't. For decades, his guilt was treated as settled, not because the science supported it, but because a confession and a guilty plea were allowed to outweigh everything that came after. But science doesn't stand still, and when the evidence in this case was finally examined through a modern lens, it told a very different story. DNA excluded Marvin from every piece of biological evidence. Expert analysis showed his confession didn't align with the facts, and the timeline made his involvement impossible. In the end, even the state was forced to acknowledge what the evidence made clear. On June 18, 2024, the courts ruled that Marvin Grimm Jr. was innocent. But an exoneration can't give back lost decades. It can't erase the years spent behind bars, or the years spent living under suspicion after release. What it can do is remind us why forensic science matters, why it must be questioned, updated, and applied with care, and why certainty should never come at the expense of truth, because when science is misunderstood or ignored, the consequences aren't theoretical, they're human.
Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. Thank you for listening and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.